reforms with Rwanda's High Commissioner to South Africa. That is Vincent Karega, as well Dr. David Monyae, who is an international relations political analyst. I'll come back to you, especially on what President Kagame was talking about, the good intentions and the money to back it. The criticism against the AU has been that it's not robust enough in getting involved in situations where there's conflict and there's been human rights violations. So even if the intentions are there, you can't talk about money as being the problem for not being forceful enough in preventing some of these things from happening.
Indeed. I think the crisis that we've seen, whether it's DRC, Zimbabwe, in quite a number of countries, where head of states go beyond their terms of staying in power. President Kabila has been there. He promised to leave according to what the DRC constitution dictates, but he's still there, and every other African head of state is quiet about it. I think there is a need to put much more teeth in terms of resolutions, actions that are taken, and to ensure that you enforce what you say you're going to do. If there are sanctions, what kind of sanctions? How to ensure that leaders will come into power and live according to the rules and regulation in the constitutions. So the AU is not living up to now. Up to now, it's not doing more in that area. And there's too much reliance on external powers. A lot of, whether it's private or foreign governments, and some do pay some of these fees. And it's a sad story that you still have your France, your United States, your all these big powers have so much influence and hold on what Africans do and say.
I'll get to that about the AU having a bigger voice in the strategic partnerships, but I am curious about the behind-the-scenes machinations, High Commissioner. Those who say egos temper down those good intentions of implementing reforms. And when we're talking about these reforms in particular, some are saying, are we sure that Egypt wants to go ahead and carry the baton from President Kagame, that perhaps there's some resentment over it being suspended in 2013, that there's something personal that will prevent it from carrying through with an agenda?
I think we should not preempt what is going to be next, and I believe those who have sealed a deal will still be around to know what is the next step and what is a step backward. So it is important, as everybody wishes to see an AU that is working, and I know it requires a lot. And the AU looks like countries themselves. So the more the members are weak, definitely the bigger body is weak. And also, the bigger body, when it becomes strong or efficient, it can help even the individual weaknesses to be faster overcome. So it's like the chicken and the egg. So we need to work in countries, build systems, build economies, while we are building as well our continent, so as to build the voice, the necessary content to feed into into every individual country as a way of transforming the continent. So it's work at home, work at regional, and work at continental. But and it's work in progress.
I'd like to ask Dr. Monyae to contribute on this one. It's a real thing, though, that competing priorities and the egoism of some countries, Dr. Monyae, when Rabat re-entered the AU, there were objections from some member states who said, actually, you are flouting the principles of the African Union. So there's a power play that seems to be derailing the greater vision, according to some, of what the AU is and what it stands for.
I think that it's a disease that started as far back as 1963, that power resides with head of states. Nothing moves within AU without head of states. I mean, that differs from the European Union, where the institution itself has a strong bureaucracy, strong research capacity, strong rules that go beyond the head of states. And we haven't reached that level. And perhaps what the High Commissioner is saying, it's a gradual approach. But for how long are we going to wait?
This is my question, for how long?
We can't wait. We have to be much more radical and challenge our leaders on a number of areas. For instance, behavioral issues. We have head of states, when they go with the entire entourage of 20, 30 people, and people who are not supposed to be going, secretaries and all sorts of people, who they go there to service not the AU, just to service the politicians in terms of what they need, running with papers around, and there isn't much that is being done. It's like a holiday where people go in for a few days and then they fly back home. We should cut some of this wastage and rely much more on a rigorous bureaucracy that knows what it is doing, research at the AU level, ensure only head of states who go there with few people who are relevant. Also, the kind of representation that all African countries have within Ethiopia could then service you, cut costs, and divert some of those resources.
So we'll come back to casting in just a moment. High Commissioner, I want to talk about that bigger voice when we're talking about AU reform and the strategic partners, the EU, the UN, for instance. If you look at some of the bigger conflicts, South Sudan, the Central African Republic, the disputes along the Nile, the stance of the US in Somalia, some are saying that's part of the problem, that because we have a Pied Piper, we aren't taking strong enough action.
To take strong action, we need to be strong enough. And as you know, most African problems are definitely internal to countries, but they are, in most cases, also linked to external factors. And some individual countries cannot overcome on their own the issues, especially to do with external factors. They need the help of the other Africans. And there are cases whereby Africans have tried to help stabilize some of the countries, at least for a while. I remember SADC playing a role in Madagascar. I remember the East Africans getting into Somalia and trying to lessen the problem, and also many actions in ECOWAS and so on. But we need more, and we need motive, as you keep on saying. It's a gradual approach. So that's what actually the reforms mean.
Would collapsing the commission and making them less help them more efficient?
We need to work as well on our bureaucracy and on our systems, including how do we recruit, how do we assess progress, the performance contract system, and judging people according to performance, not just being there for political representation, regional representation, or country representation, but be there for both. You represent a region, but at the same time you qualify for a position that has been clearly defined and that we have been interviewed for. And all those components of reform, streamlining, and making the bureaucracy smaller, lean, and the decision-making process much more effective and much more grounded into the hands of the bureaucrats, not just the top politicians.
So one of those reforms that's been suggested, Dr. Monyae, is that perhaps the Commission chair could choose his or her deputy, including the commissioners. How would that play out in reality?
It will be a big challenge, given the fact that there's a lot of competition in terms of all African regions. Each region is on standby. We're going to have our own person in there. And I think that mentality needs to change. Have the commissioner selecting in a balanced way. You have to have mechanisms where not one region, West Africa, for instance, dominating the AU, or Southern Africa. You need to have a balanced all regions, but at the same time, emphasizing much more on skills of those people who go there, who are able to articulate issues of Africa, the African agenda, and also to avoid having this never-ending process of issuing documents and new policies. You have to have African agenda. You need to measure it and say, since its implementation, how far have we gone? What's lacking? What have we need to cut?
Speaking of timelines, we have run out of time, but High Commissioner, perhaps in 30 seconds,
Sure.
what would be a reasonable but strict enough timeline?
For every activity, there's a specific timeline. There are activities that may take months, years, and activities that can be carried out within a day. But what is important is to have a clear plan of action with indicators, with proper timelines. So working according to modern techniques and methodology in a measurable way. That's what we want in the EU.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about the economic front, just in terms of the agreements that have been mooted, and also look at corruption and how this impacts on reform in the African Union. We'll be right back.